Is it possible to back the US dollar with Bitcoin someday?
On Twitter, people are constrained to short tweets. And so sometimes people get in fights over semantics. And so we're arguing over the use of the word back. And if a politician said, I'm going to enhance the United States by owning some Bitcoin, or I'm going to enhance the credibility of the central bank by having them invest in Bitcoin, I don't think you would have seen the same degree of combativeness. I think that it's, a lot of times people create these extreme cases so they can disagree. but let's take another view of it, which is it good for a bank to own some Bitcoin or not own Bitcoin? And the answer is it'd be better if the bank owned some Bitcoin. Is it good for a country to own some Bitcoin or not own it? I mean, you're better if you own it. Is there any entity on earth that wouldn't be better off owning Bitcoin? I can't think of one. I mean, if we think Bitcoin is good, then why wouldn't you think it's good to have some, right? If you take 1% of the assets of the central bank and you buy Bitcoin with it, you haven't backed the dollar with it. That's true. You have enhanced the credibility of our reserves by owning a hard asset. You would, on the margin, let's take an extreme, right? If you had $100 billion of assets and they're all Bitcoin, yeah, we'd like that better than 1 billion of assets in Bitcoin and 99 billion in something else. And we'd like a billion in Bitcoin better than 0 Bitcoin. So I think they're all just degrees of quality of the balance sheet. I think that the question of when is something backed by Bitcoin, right, is less important than are people choosing to adopt Bitcoin as a treasury asset and incrementally or gradually accumulate it. If you have, I'll give you an example of another extreme, right? Turkey. Well, if Turkey has a balance of payments problem of 20 billion a year, like if they're basically running a $20 billion a year deficit, and if they had $50 billion of gold, if they chose to sell the $50 billion of gold and buy $50 billion of Bitcoin and then announce to the world that they're going to back their currency with Bitcoin, or right now, did you know they're backed by gold? I mean, they're sort of backed by gold, but it's not helping them because gold isn't appreciating in value over time. And so it's not really helpful. And the definition of what does it mean to be backed by? Do you need to be 100% or 1,000%? I mean, it used to be we were on a gold standard backed 10% or 20% by Bitcoin. So I'm going to leave off the semantic question of what percentage coverage do you need to call it back. But I would say if Turkey adopted Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset instead of gold, and they announced it to the public, they would start a run on gold and they would start a run on Bitcoin. What would happen is Bitcoin would double or triple, gold would crash, other countries would follow their lead. Their 50 billion in Bitcoin would become 150 billion in Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, as you know, I think my view is over 100 years, Bitcoin's going to appreciate theoretically 15% a year. So if you were holding $150 billion of Bitcoin appreciating at 15% a year, you can reasonably say to the general public, we're generating $20 billion of Bitcoin gains every year, and we're offsetting $20 billion of an operating currency deficit every year. And we have now effectively backed our lira. And now people would look at that and say, I guess the lira should strengthen. So the lira would strengthen. You would plug the deficits with Bitcoin. Gold would crash as a money, but that's okay because gold's not working anyway. All the people in Turkey would be benefited. And so that's an example where if it's a small enough country with a small enough problem and they take a big enough chunk of Bitcoin, then you can actually meaningfully move the economy or move the currency. Now that's a lot of Bitcoin to buy, right? You could say maybe 50 billion is unprecedented, but now if we went to a smaller country, and there's a lot of smaller countries, that had a currency with a much lower float, you can see how if they adopted Bitcoin as their primary treasury reserve asset and announced they're backing the currency with it, they could issue their currency, they could generate reserve returns and strengthen the entire nation. Sovereign wealth funds do this, right? In Norway, in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, in Singapore, they have sovereign wealth funds, or they have sovereign funds, and the goal is to make investments in assets that will appreciate in value to back their currencies. And they use those portfolios either to engage in open market transactions to stabilize their currency, or they use it to show that they are backed and financially solvent. So the idea of adopting Bitcoin as a reserve asset at the sovereign level isn't unreasonable. I think 1% is a huge commitment for the nation of the U.S., right? When someone has $100 trillion worth of whatever, trillions of dollars of exposure, and they say 1%, that makes sense. I don't think it'd be responsible for, a presidential candidate to say more than 1% right now, given the fact that Bitcoin isn't really big enough to take that kind of demand. I think if you run a country, Monaco, Singapore, right, a smaller country, then I think you could probably go to more than 1%. And I think that I don't choose to dwell on the debate about whether 1% is backing. I get it. You could say it needs to be 50% backed before you use the word back. But I think that the more important point is, should a sovereign hold Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset, and what can you expect to accomplish? And I think for a mega company, it's symbolic, and it will be good for the country and economic development in the country. But it doesn't necessarily solve your inflation problem or your currency problem. But for a smaller country, for an Argentina or Turkey or Lebanon, or Nigeria, if you're attempting to establish credibility for your currency on the world stage, right now the lira, the peso, the naira don't have much credibility. If you were to announce that you're actually adopting Bitcoin as your primary treasury reserve asset and backing your currency with Bitcoin, I think you have a lot more chance to actually move the needle on your currency strength and change the perception of your nation and change capital flows. So I think it would be meaningful at that level, depending upon how much of a deficit you're running. Right? When the deficit is 20 billion and you have 50 billion in Bitcoin assets, you can make a dent. But when your deficit is, when you only commit $1 billion in Bitcoin against a $20 billion deficit, well, that's just not enough to make a difference. So I think there's a case by case issue. And I don't think it's constructive to get into debates about whether the sentence should have been constructed with the word backed as opposed to invested. I think that the material thing is, are you adopting Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset? Primary, secondary, one of 100, one of 2, one of 3, and what percentage?